What happens when the US and Canada get into a trade war, and what would it look like? A recent trade dispute where US policies targeted imports from 60 countries and Canada retaliated with tariffs has provided some insight. The result was a dramatic shift in the supply chain that left American supermarket shelves empty. Reports show that shortages and price hikes quickly spread to 10 states bordering Canada or with direct trade ties. Here are the 10 states that felt the biggest impact from this trade dispute. Michigan. Michigan is the largest bridge for agricultural and food trade between the two countries. The road networks, ports, and cold storage facilities in Detroit and Port Huron serve as major hubs for millions of tons of food each year, especially dairy, beef, poultry, grains, and fresh produce. On the export side, many dairy farms in counties like Ottawa and Oregon rely on the Canadian market for 40% to 60% of their revenue. In return, Michigan retailers import a wide range of goods from Canada, including fruits, vegetables, processed grains, and seafood. Within 24 hours of Canada announcing new restrictions, the distribution system hit a gridlock. Walmart, Costco, and Meijer stores in major cities like Detroit and Ann Arbor reported shelves nearly empty of milk, butter, cheese, and deli meats. Familiar Canadian products like syrup and cookies vanished, and some stores even had to impose purchase limits on essentials. The impact on farmers and businesses was severe. Many farms were forced to dump thousands of liters of milk they couldn't export, while meat and cheese processing plants had to cut production and lay off workers. If the situation continued, dairy prices in Michigan could spike 20% to 30%, and small farms risked bankruptcy. Vermont. Vermont's economy is famous for high-quality dairy and maple syrup, and it is tightly linked with Canada, especially Quebec. Before the tariffs, over 50% of Vermont's artisanal cheese and butter production was exported to Canada. The state is also the top producer of maple syrup in the U.S., with a significant portion sold to Canada for packaging and redistribution to Europe. When Ottawa rolled out its retaliatory measures, orders were immediately cancelled. Small artisanal cheese producers had to pause production due to high storage costs. On the import side, supermarkets in Montpelier and Rutland saw empty shelves where Canadian candy, baking mixes, and oats used to be. The prices for replacement products shot up 15% to 25% in just a few days. The ripple effect was severe, putting family farms with slim profit margins at risk of bankruptcy. Maple syrup producers lost long-standing export contracts, directly impacting thousands of seasonal workers. Vermont. Vermont's economy is famous for high-quality dairy and maple syrup, and it is tightly linked with Canada, especially Quebec. Before the tariffs, over 50% of Vermont's artisanal cheese and butter production was exported to Canada. The state is also the top producer of maple syrup in the U.S., with a significant portion sold to Canada for packaging and redistribution to Europe. When Ottawa rolled out its retaliatory measures, orders were immediately cancelled. Small artisanal cheese producers had to pause production due to high storage costs. On the import side, supermarkets in Montpelier and Rutland saw empty shelves where Canadian candy, baking mixes, and oats used to be. The prices for replacement products shot up 15% to 25% in just a few days. The ripple effect was severe, putting family farms with slim profit margins at risk of bankruptcy. Maple syrup producers lost long-standing export contracts, directly impacting thousands of seasonal workers. New York. New York has a vast agricultural region in the north and northwest, bordering Canada through key crossings like Buffalo and Champlain. Farms in the Finger Lakes and Hudson Valley supply milk, cheese, beef, and apples to the Canadian market, while New York imports processed cheese, deli meats, and berries from Canada. Within the first 24 hours, many Walmart, Costco, and Wegmans stores in cities like Buffalo and Albany reported empty shelves in their cheese, deli meat, and berry sections. Restaurants in New York City complained that prices for imported beef and seafood jumped 20% to 30%. Apple and grape farmers worried about losing the Ontario market, facing the risk of hundreds of tons of produce going unsold. Dairy farms that depend on exports to Canada for 50% of their revenue began losing money immediately. Maine. Maine's economy, particularly in cities like Portland and Bar Harbor, relies heavily on seafood exports to Canada. After the tariffs, it was estimated that 30% to 40% of the catch could not cross the border, forcing suppliers to either sell domestically at rock-bottom prices or store their products in freezers. It wasn't just seafood, agriculture also took a hit. Potatoes, once exported to Canada for packaged fries, began piling up in warehouses. Meanwhile, Canadian milk, cheese, and butter imports dropped dramatically, leaving supermarket shelves in cities like Bangor and Augusta nearly empty. Fishermen and farmers warned that they might have to lay off seasonal workers or temporarily halt operations. The long-term risk is that Maine could lose a large portion of its strategic seafood export market, putting thousands, bordering Manitoba and Ontario, is one of the largest producers and processors of pork, grains, and dairy in the U.S. The state consistently ranks among the top exporters of pork, chicken, corn, and soybeans to Canada, and in return, imports processed seafood, candy, and beer. As soon as Ottawa implemented tariffs, meat processing plants reported sharp drops in Canadian orders. They had to cut production shifts and put workers on rotating furloughs. Pork inventories piled up, driving domestic prices down, while ironically, retail prices still climbed due to rising transportation costs. In Minneapolis, shoppers saw empty shelves for eggs, deli meats, and fresh milk. Pig farmers who were heavily reliant on the Canadian market lost their largest source of demand, putting severe strain on their cash flow. North Dakota. North Dakota, bordering Manitoba and Saskatchewan, is known for its wheat, canola, and soybean production, serving as a critical supplier for both U.S. and Canadian food processing. Thousands of trucks cross the border every month to maintain this trade relationship. When Ottawa tightened import rules, wheat and canola farmers in counties like Cass and Grand Forks suddenly lost a major market, leaving thousands of tons of crops sitting idle. Canola oil processing plants had to cut production as Canadian export contracts were cancelled. Consumers immediately felt the pressure, with supermarkets in Grand Forks and Bismarck quickly reporting shortages of cooking oil, flour, and many packaged foods that normally came from Canada. Prices for these items shot up 15% to 25% in just 1 week. Montana. Montana, with its vast grasslands and golden wheat valleys, has long been tightly linked to the Canadian market. The border it shares with Alberta and British Columbia is an economic lifeline for the state's agriculture. When Ottawa imposed retaliatory tariffs, the trade flow ground to a halt. Cattle ranchers watched live cattle prices plummet as contracts were cancelled. Wheat and oat farmers had storage bins overflowing, waiting for prices to rebound. On the shelves in cities like Kalispell and Missoula, locals quickly noticed familiar products disappearing: Canadian milk, butter, and frozen salmon. The remaining items shot up 20% to 30% in price, and many stores imposed purchase limits. Idaho. Idaho is famous for its potato fields and large-scale dairy industry, which are tightly linked to the Canadian market. Cross-border trade routes through Montana and Washington serve as Idaho's agricultural lifeline. The moment Ottawa imposed tariffs, the shockwaves hit Idaho almost immediately. Frozen French fries piled up in warehouses because Canadian factories refused shipments. Butter, cheese, and powdered milk saw orders halted, forcing companies to cut production. Consumers in Boise and Coeur d'Alene felt the impact within days. Yogurt, Canadian cheese, and many imported sweets vanished from supermarket shelves, and the prices of remaining butter and cheese shot up 20% to 25%. Washington. Washington is one of the most important states in U.S.-Canada trade, sharing over 780 kilometers of border with British Columbia. The state is a major producer of apples, cherries, wheat, dairy, and seafood. After Ottawa imposed tariffs, farmers in the Yakima Valley lost export markets for apples and cherries, forcing them to sell domestically at lower prices. Fishers harvesting salmon and crab lost contracts with processors in Vancouver and Victoria. Consumers in Seattle and Spokane quickly felt the impact. Imported products from Canada, such as smoked salmon and cheese, disappeared from many supermarkets. Prices for imported seafood and cheese soared 20% to 35% in just a week. Alaska. Alaska is almost entirely dependent on imported food, with much of it passing through Canada via road, sea, or air. About 90% of the food consumed in the state is imported, with Canada serving as a critical gateway. When Ottawa imposed tariffs, the shock quickly reached Anchorage and Fairbanks. Many refrigerated trucks were stuck at the Yukon border, and supermarkets reported empty shelves for milk, butter, cheese, and fresh vegetables. Prices for many items surged 25% to 40% within a few days. The seafood industry also faced reverse effects. While Alaska is famous for salmon and crab, much of the catch is exported to Canada for processing. As trade slowed, processing plants had to reduce operations, and frozen stocks piled up. Food security became a serious concern, as Alaska's geography leaves very few alternative supply options.